There's a moment in almost every changing city when capital is circling and a new anchor project is on the horizon, and the neighborhood has to decide, will this be growth that happens to us or growth that happens with us? Today's episode takes us to Woodlawn, on Chicago's South Side, a neighborhood with deep cultural roots, a long history of organizing, and decades of disinvestment. With the Obama Presidential Center nearby and new pressure building across the South Side, Woodlawn is at a critical moment. My guest is Byron Brazier, lead developer of Woodlawn Central, a nearly $895 million catalytic project anchored by the Apostolic Church of God, an institution that has spent nearly a century building credibility in the neighborhood. Byron shares how his grandfather and father helped lead the church and build Woodlawn's organizing backbone, and how that legacy has evolved into a development approach rooted in self-determination. In this episode, we get into what it takes to make a mission-driven project pencil, why Byron pushed back on the default playbook of heavy subsidies and low-income tax credits, how the team is thinking about market creation in a place of heavy vacancy, and why he believes the goal isn't avoiding gentrification, it's preventing displacement. I'm Kate Gasparo, and this is Building Better Cities. I'm always curious how someone gets into development. You have a background in design and architecture. So how do you make the transition, and how do you think about the transition from being an artist in some respects to a developer and what people more conventionally think of as the business side of the built environment?
The transition from artist to developer was a little easier for me because I needed to be able to explain the vision with a particular type of design language. And having that language to the design side of it was easier. I think the most challenging part was unpacking all of the complexities of the social side of development when you are speaking with elected officials, governance, leadership, pastors, stakeholders, and residents. All of those languages are very different. Transitioning to that, the design piece was kind of easy. It was the other is that kind of came through just, trial by fire.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like as a developer, you sort of sit between all of these different stakeholders and partners, and they all speak a different language.
Yeah.
And you're trying to align them towards one goal. And that's the art of the developer, I guess.
Definitely.
So Woodlawn Central is interesting because it's framed as a development from the inside out. So what were early signs that the community, and specifically the church, and I want you to talk about your history with the church, were ready to take on a project of this scale?
The history of my family is my grandfather was a bishop at the church, Apostolic Church of God in Chicago, in Woodlawn, but he was also a community developer as well. He has done about 17 different projects within Woodlawn. And so he started the Woodlawn organization, or how people would notice TWO. And TWO was kind of the backbone of how Woodlawn became such an organized community. And my father, who continued my grandfather's legacy, but he evolved the TWO into the network of Woodlawn, which is the NWO. And so the network of Woodlawn was created as a community developer organization, to where the community itself had a lot more input than just developers coming in and, checking the box and saying, okay, we had a meeting, or we had our 2 meetings, or we had our 3 meetings, and then still doing whatever they wanted to do, despite the community's most desired effect for the process. So when that happens, typically within communities with lower annual median incomes, these developers come in with these massive subsidies, and they build low to moderately low income housing, which perpetuates the impoverishment into the community. And it still destabilizes the community because you're not bringing any commercial aspect or any jobs or any circulation, economic circulation to the community. You're just doing housing. And so with this being kind of the traditional way of looking at it, and having a background in feasibility studies and community organization and ground up urbanism, I started working with my father. And I said, you're doing a really great job at putting together these foundational understandings of economic development, health, safety, education. But as a developer or a community developer organization, you have to have a project.
Mm-hmm.
And that started the conversation. And I said, well, what's your project? And they're like, well, we don't know. And I said, all right, well, this is great. And that's when it kicked off the discovery process that I do to kind of outline these next, few stages of how the community can, one, self-discover, two, be self-determined, and then three, finally self-develop. So the whole concept is making sure that those who are already in the community are anchored, and then that they also have an opportunity to culturally grow out the community that creates that social and economic sustainability, e.g., development without displacement.
I love that. And when you're talking about like the project, how do you realize, actuate, and make it tangible all of these principles and the theory of this form of development?
So the process to getting the community to absorb these ambitious ideas of self-development, I had to go and talk to all the residents, all the stakeholders, all the leaders, sit down, interview them, because it was really important to understand one of the interesting parts about the Black community, especially in Woodlawn. The divide is not cultural, it's socioeconomic. It's based on, I think, quintessentially the have and have nots.
Hmm.
And being able to kind of intertwine those immediate needs, the future needs, the extreme forecast, how do you then tie these things together and then be able to look at the landscape of the 2 square miles of the community and say, here's where you start, right? But during Rahm Emanuel's tenure, he had closed down like 50 schools, which was kind of not a good thing. But ultimately what it did was it created an opportunity for adaptive reuse project, which is what I pitched to the community as a 2060 model. Not what we're going to do in 2060, but what we should have by 2060.
Hmm.
Right. And so these 4 schools then became kind of the cornerstones of the entire project, and then basing these schools as cultural nodes. And so we broke down culture in the form of technology, agriculture, visual arts, retail, and performing arts. And each of these schools now have the ability to actually build on the campus for residential and then reuse those schools as a place for either cultural or commercial opportunities. And so we presented that in 2019, 2020. The University of Montana architecture students, the third year, fifth year students came and they did a whole vision board, scale models for us pro bono. And what it did was it allowed the community to visually see the possibilities
Hmm.
of what their woodlawn could look like, right?
Yeah. I love the different facets and these nodes from the 4 schools and how they're not just ability to build housing, but as you said, economic development and empowerment for the community itself. So let's go back to the question of scale, just so I can visualize it myself. The community itself is 2 miles, 2 square miles.
Mhm.
There are 4 schools that are sort of the nodes of the master plan.
Mhm.
And then the first phase is
The first phase is Woodlawn Central.
great.
It's really the catalyst phase because these schools are still owned by the city, the church being one of the larger stakeholders and having all of this available land in form of parking lots.
Mhm.
I told this Dr. Brazier said, look, you're doing a lot of meetings, you're going to have to put your money where your mouth is, right? And
Mhm.
you're actually show what this looks like. And so I kind of broke it down to him. It took a little minute for him to kind of absorb it because churches are very insular, right? They don't do a lot of economic development. They do a lot of benevolence and
Mhm.
social services, right? Through spiritual mission driven. But the church in and of itself is also changing and evolving in its dynamic to where it almost needs to come outside of the walls to participate because the church in our community is the only organization that's actually created a critical mass.
Mm.
It's created a trust factor, right? Where developers don't have that trust factor.
Mhm.
Churches do. So it's kind of a mix. And so Woodlawn Central is a micro version of this big 2060 plan for the community. Because the community plan is, we're talking, 4, 5, 6 billion dollars, right?
Mhm.
And then we're talking, let's say a catalyst project, which is, 895 million to a billion, but it is driven from a private development
Mhm. You talked about this tension between private development, the church, and trust. And that's a strong cultural layer, especially for a neighborhood like Woodlawn that has a rich activist history and periods of disinvestment. Can you talk about what elements of Woodlawn's history have influenced Woodlawn Central as the first phase of this community master plan?
The catalyst, the most modern catalyst for Woodlawn Central would probably be the new Obama Center. That'll be a 10-minute walk from our project site. But it also has a history, well, Chicago itself has a long history of redlining and segregation. And the University of Chicago has not always been a friend and partner as they are today.
Hmm.
And so there was a lot of tension between Woodlawn proper and the University of Chicago because they kept trying to push their catchment area further to the south, which only serves them, in their purpose as an institution. Right?
Hmm.
They may have invested billions of dollars in the community, but not any of it really into the people. And I think that's the tension that most traditionalists, fundamentalists, and institutionalists miss is that you can't just build buildings. You have to build people to go into those buildings to actually create a balanced ecosystem.
Hmm. We've already talked about this a little bit, but there's an inherent gap between what traditional, some would say predatory development looks like,
Mhm.
and the feel that Woodlawn needed to lead its own regeneration strategy rather than wait for outside investment.
Yeah.
Is that something that was shared widely? And what sort of past attempts manifested themselves in Woodlawn that drove the community to really think about this self regeneration?
Great question. During after our announcement, we had a lot of interest. People were calling us VCs, investors. The common denominator of pretty much every conversation was we're going to bring in low income tax credits and subsidies to build Woodlawn Central. And I was like, oh, no, you're not. Because you can't put low income tax credits into the natural asset portion of the community, which by design deserves market rate to luxury access. Because what we ended up having to do was borrow the AMI from the lakefront to then quantify the investment for Woodlawn Central. Which wasn't easy, but it was an easy pivot from the conversation we were having with these multiple investors and developers. And a lot of them wouldn't even touch it because of how the valuation process happens, right? So even
Hmm.
though we're in 60637 and you do your research on 60637 and the AMI is $23,000, well, there's no way I can put in market rate investment into a community that has such a low, annual median income, right?
Hmm.
But there's over 300 acres of vacant land. One of the things that we did in our concept master plan was I said, don't build a pro forma that is in the current market, build the pro forma that's in the future market so that they can see that there is an ROI here outside of these heavy subsidies. They're like, well, is this an opportunity zone? Well, yeah, part of it is.
Hmm. Hmm.
Right. And so we can actually do some kind of hybrid process that allows the project to be a market rate and affordable, 20% affordable, which is a mandate in Woodlawn. We can still do that, right? This whole thing doesn't have to be affordable or low income. It would just devastate the entire rest of the 2 square miles of the community if we had done that.
That's so interesting. Can you talk a little bit about the mechanics? I worked on previous master plans in the Midwest where there's a lot of vacancy. So it's difficult to build a pro forma when you don't have enough diversity of housing to justify the rents that you will see in the future once people see the vision. I'm curious with how strong the self regeneration strategy is and the ethos of this plan, how do you build market rate that borrows from another neighborhood's AMI and not induce a gentrification snowball?
Mhm.
And what is the balance there and the mechanism of the market rate and the 20% affordable so that gentrification isn't a byproduct?
Right. I believe gentrification is not a bad thing. I believe displacement through gentrification is the bad thing, right? And a lot of times when you're looking at our community, the Black community, they're doing corner to corner development, right? So you can't necessarily make one corner pencil. You have to do a district development that looks at the span of 215,000 commercial square feet, almost 900 units of residential space, and a theater, and vertical farming, and parking, and multi-generational. Like, you have to almost think big enough
Hmm.
so that way there's room to maneuver within that pro forma. So it had to be a big enough project, in order to kind of quantify that. And then also the concept pro forma also helped with the visioning of saying, okay, these are the possibilities, and then here are some new models which make the old models obsolete, by being able to say we are a part of the lakefront. Even though we
Hmm.
are 60637, we are technically a part of a lakefront and deserve the same respect from an AMI to be able to get that level of investment.
I've been having a lot of conversations with developers around low income housing tax credits. It's sort of like the tool in the toolbox that everyone gravitates towards when you're thinking about affordable housing.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of trade offs that you make when you decide to use LIHTC. And it
Mhm.
seems that you came to that realization early. Are there other developers that you've been working with, or other examples in which they're doing this scaled development where the cross subsidy of the market rate is enabling the affordable?
Yes, and that is the go-to, right?
Mhm.
And I think the hardest part about the development industry is that most developers don't live in the community. So they don't actually have a reference or anything referential to be able to say, this is the quality of life that I'm
Mhm.
building for these people. You're not looking at the quality of life. You're looking at the lifespan of your building, right? And saying, when should I buy and when should I sell, right? It's very transactional and it's zero transformational, right? And so when you're talking about Woodlawn Central or projects like Woodlawn Central, the narrative must be a transformational narrative. It
Mhm.
has to say that we're not just building buildings, we're building people. We'll have 700 new jobs available just on this site alone. And that should then inspire other developers to say, oh, yes, by the way, there's a corridor there. There are 300 acres of vacant land. And then over in the next community, there's 1,000 acres of vacant land that's owned by the city.
Mhm. You were talking about the first phase is 895 million,
Mhm.
and future phases could accumulate to billions of dollars of investment. Who are the types of financial partners that you've been reaching out to that see the promise of this vision and want to help Woodlawn get there?
So that's a very good question. One of the first things that I find when it comes to financing is that nobody wants to build it for you, right? They want to support, but they're not going to help. So it's important that if you're going to do something which is really interesting, and how my grandfather did this whole process was he made sure that the entire church and the entire land was debt free. And I had to kind of explain down the road that, having debt free land is not the flex. It's having debt free land and being able to leverage it for higher investment. That's the flex.
Mhm. Yes.
So, they were holding real tight onto that land. And I was like, look, you're going to have to loosen up a little bit if you want to get this thing through entitlements, if you want to get this thing through to a detailed master plan, if you want to get it to that, then that's when all of the other investment opens, right? All of the treasurer, is more interested because you did all the heavy lifting. And that's the hard part, right? You've got to deal with the attorneys, you've got to deal with the city, you've got to deal with the commissioners, and you got to deal with our aldermen. So these are all steps and stages that traditional developers do not want to deal with. Most investors are like, call me when you get there, if you get there. And so, yeah, that's really kind of the secret sauce within doing something at this level, is being able to get it to shovel ready.
Mhm. And you have a big milestone this month of December,
Mhm.
in taking the plan through entitlements. Can you talk through that? I think that might be one of the final steps to getting to shovel ready, and is
Yeah.
making sure entitlements are in place,
Yes.
especially for this site.
Yeah. So we have answered all of our questions back to the Department of Planning. We'll be putting in our application by, I think, next couple weeks. And that application will then go into the city council. Then we will have our plan commission meeting, and then we'll have our full city council meeting, and then we will have our entitlements. Once you get in through the intake, then it's all procedural.
Yes.
But they would have already, they would have already said, "Hey, this doesn't look good. We're not gonna, I don't think you should rethink all of this." And
Mm.
we didn't get that. We got, okay, we need this. How are you gonna do this? And so we've got a super A team. We've got Gensler, we've got we've got for our landscapers, we've got some good engineers. I've got a good master planner. So the team is they know how to get through the process.
It seems like it takes a lot of money to get to this part of the process
Yeah.
without even a sight on a return. So how are you self-financing or bringing together the resources to support an incredible team like this?
So the thankful part of the blessing of this is that the church can do some of this early on stuff. But
Mm.
a part of my pitch to the board and the congregation is that I would find ways to finance this in a very specific way. So one of the first stops that we did was talking to our state rep and our state senator. And we did get a $30 million grant from the state of Illinois,
Amazing.
appropriated. Thank you. So we got some of it allocated recently. And
Hmm.
so that takes a lot of pressure off of us getting through these first master plannings. But this was, this is really kind of a divine order in which all of these things are happening. I could never guarantee that they were going to do it, but I knew that the plan was solid. It had the right language, it had the right vision, it was transformational, it had jobs, it had housing, it had affordable housing. So you couldn't possibly say no to
Yes.
you can possibly say no. I mean, so the idea of a feasibility study, is it feasible? Yes, because there's nothing there. But, the idea of like how much is it going to cost then changes the narrative. But then you say, okay, well, here's where we start and then here's where we finish. And so that was a part of the whole financing process as well.
Okay, amazing. I did read that the church has committed to reinvesting 10% of the profits back into the community. And I've written a lot about what community equity development means and this reinvestment revolving fund, sort of reinvesting in the community so that it can continue to invest in itself. How is that dollar amount going to be leveraged to prevent displacement in the community?
The overall meaning for the 10% back is that the church always receives 10%.
Hmm.
And it never is giving back 10% in any kind of way. And so one of the conversations speaking with Dr. Brazier, was saying, hey, think about this and think about that. And it'd be really great to making sure that the church is not just intaking all of this revenue, but also is making sure that it's giving back in the form of economic development, health and human services, public safety, education, everything that the network of Woodlawn is mission driven about. Those are the things, whether it be programmatically or developmentally, there's going to be a hike in taxes, right?
Hmm.
There's some people who own their homes, but they don't have enough income to cover their taxes. These are the types of programs that the church is going to do to making sure that that displacement doesn't happen.
Okay. That leads me to my next question about how you have structured the ownership, governance, and decision making to get to this point. And then how do you think about it moving forward, especially around bringing in institutional capital and development partners that could maybe change the way that decision making moves forward?
The governance of Woodlawn Central has evolved from when we first started. As the church began to learn more about the development process, it then created a LLC called ACOG Ventures, which would then ultimately become the master developer. And then that master developer would then do a joint venture with another site developer or equity partner or however, where there's a GP or an LP. And then they would then work together on making sure that X was created. And so Woodlawn Central LLC is the overall lead development, making sure that the concept, the promises made or promises kept, the culture, all of those things stayed in place. And then there are other elements of property management and security and maintenance that's strictly with the ACOG venture side. So the church stays covered from its 501c3 by not participating directly into the development and having this additional entity to be able to work in that for-profit side. So people are like, okay, well, what happens to the land, right? Like the land is no more tax exempt. Correct.
Mhm.
But we're not, but we're, since we're doing it in phases, then all those taxes get absorbed within that phase of the pro forma of that phase.
Okay. I want to talk a little bit about how, in your conversations with policymakers, elected officials, what is the timeline of the public disposition of land that is meant to be part of the holistic Woodlawn Master Plan?
Ooh, yeah, that's great. The overall plan, as far as governance and our municipal partners, it's in the making. They don't have a permanent job. They're always on display based upon their ability to legislate and build.
Hmm.
And those are some really, really key things when we're looking at new models, replacing old models, is that typically and traditionally the Black community votes and elects protesters or managers who don't know how to build and who don't know how to legislate. Those are two very, very key things in getting something large scale vision like Woodlawn Central or a large scale 2060 plan, making sure that our local elected officials really understand that this is not a power play, right? Nobody's trying to grab land. This is a trust based, faith impact based initiative driven by a church that's almost 100 years old. And no one can deny the level in which the church has invested into the community itself.
Some of the elements we talked about today are deeply place specific and deeply specific to the Black community and Black redevelopment of these areas that have been redlined and disinvested in for decades, if not centuries. And then there are elements of our conversation today that are scalable to communities all throughout the country and possibly in other countries in the world.
Mhm.
Can you sort of divide up the conversation and pull out some elements that are deeply specific and the scalable to help our listeners sort of organize all of these thoughts for themselves?
Yeah, so something that's very specific is the alignment of the institutions, right? Aligning church and governance and banking and education to understand what those things are so that each of those institutions can have their own understanding on how they contribute to what should be not a form of unity, but a form of innovation.
Hmm.
Once you can get your institutional foundation solid, then you can start adding your infrastructure on top of that in the form of physical infrastructure, your design engineering, so forth and so on. And then your digital infrastructure, your computation, your smart city, smart campus type of things, and then your communications infrastructure, which allows for connectivity. So everyone at every level is understanding what's happening and what's going on and what to expect. And then finally, your economic infrastructure, which then allows you to be able to circulate those dollars in a very specific way.
Hmm.
And so that specifically is kind of the process that then turns into something scalable because now you can take it from a small, 100-member church to a 25,000 member church and it still be the same process, right?
Oh, I like that. And in terms of the institutional alignment in this location, the city of Chicago is very influential when it comes to these types of projects. You already referenced expansions by University of Chicago, the Obama Foundation's work nearby, and then also the state of Illinois, who has appropriated $30 million for this project. So they see the vision. Are there trends in the politics and legislative processes that are making this the right time for a vision of this scale?
Absolutely. This is the right time for this scale. And I have to make sure that my team doesn't wind me up because they think we're moving too slow. I'm like, no, we're moving at the right pace and the right speed because there are things that are happening within our world, both tangibly and intangibly. There's a generational shift, right? I think this is the last time for a long time we're going to see an 80-year-old president, right? And so
Mhm.
I think Woodlawn Central as a catalyst is not just project based, but it's also policy based. We're still dealing on 1940s zoning laws. And to create an example, you can't do a mixed use zoning outside of downtown Chicago. So put something on a trans-oriented development in the middle of a neighborhood that does not allow for mixed use zoning is like a challenge, right? What are the new zoning models? How do we remove some of these ideas of redlining, in what should be a movement, not just in Woodlawn, but the entire South Side?
As you're putting all these pieces together and tracking this policy arch, what are early indicators that you're looking for to ensure the project fulfills its original commitments of regeneration without displacement?
I don't think we're there yet.
Mm.
I think tax assessment is really maybe an early indicator on how our county tax assessor will be able to look at how we maintain a certain level of tax so the community doesn't get hit so hard with taxes, but still allows their equity to grow. So I think that is probably very preliminary to talk about, but I feel like if I'm going to peer into the future, that specifically would be a good indicator from a policy standpoint that we're moving in the right direction. So if we're looking at how to better ourselves in this specific type of development and looking at it ecologically, we should be able to present our vision, to the world and them say, okay, they really did their homework. They really understand what they're doing. They do know what they're talking about, and kind of dispel this whole myth that somehow people are choosing to be poor, right?
Mm.
Poverty is not a choice. It is something that we have to take just as much accountability for as the thing in it and of itself, right? And the system is there not as something that is ironclad, but as something that is meant to be evolved. It's meant to be changed. It's meant to be reformed, right? The better we become as people, the better we become as citizens, the better we become as policymakers, the better we become as developers.
Thanks for tuning in to Building Better Cities. If you enjoyed today's conversation, be sure to hit subscribe so you never miss another episode. And if you could help spread the word by sharing with someone, it would mean so much to us. To learn more about our work, check out buildingbettercities.com. We're excited to keep the conversation going, so until next time, let's keep building better cities together.